The story of the Rutland Railroad can be told through many resources, each shedding light on a specific aspect or period in the fascinating history of the Rutland. In the past few years, several members of the Rutland Railroad Historical Society have contributed their collections of archival material to establish the Rutland Railroad Archives at Middlebury College. Let's take a look at some of the resources in the archives and see how they each help us to better understand the big picture. The earliest item in the archives is an 1848 map of the Rutland and Burlington Railroad that was the direct predecessor of the Rutland Railroad. The Rutland Railroad came into existence when the Vermont State Legislature enacted a law in 1867 that granted a charter to the railroad. Construction funds were raised by issuing stock certificates, and the Vermont collection includes stock certificates from many of the early railroads in Vermont. Early reports to the railroad stockholders provide information on the financial condition of the railroad and statistics on the number of passengers and tons of freight carried. Some legal agreements in the archives provide insights on the intense competition between the Rutland Railroad and the Central Vermont Railroad and their fluctuating fortunes. Other legal agreements verify the acquisition of property and the leasing of necessary facilities, with very precise locations identified. The archives also include a variety of company business records from an inventory of all physical assets of the railroad compiled for the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1918 to ledgers of stock certificates surrendered in the 1920s, and an inventory of all rolling stock that was scrapped, largely as a result of railroad accidents. More detailed business records, such as bills of lading, dispatchers' records of the movement of trains, and waybills of merchandise, help us to understand how the railroad was impacted by the changing Vermont economy as it helped the economy of the state to develop. Official company memos detailed the contribution of the Rutland Railroad in military transport during World War II. Changes in facilities are easily verified over a period of years through the Sanborn fire insurance maps for many towns in Vermont, and blueprints of specific properties provide exact dimensions of some railroad properties. Photographs in our archives show in great detail the impact that floods had on the Rutland Railroad and other railroads operating in Vermont. The Great Flood of 1927 caused extensive damage and required a massive effort to restore railroad tracks and bridges for safe operation. Numerous railroad accidents were also recorded in photographs. Some of the early photographic postcards of railroad accidents in Vermont are useful for providing details for modelers on the construction of rolling stock and locomotives. And photographs donated by several members richly document the details of locomotives, cabooses, roundhouses, yards, maintenance facilities, cranes, snowplows, water tanks, tunnels, bridges, and railroad stations throughout the state. As well as some of the businesses and industries the Rutland Railroad served. Additional materials in the Rutland Railroad archives include engineering drawings, timetables, sheets of negatives from which some photographs were printed, locomotive parts lists, pamphlets, letters canceled by rail post offices, and ephemeral items including dog tags that are very different from what the typical GI would call a dog tag. The Vermont collection at Middlebury College includes many railroad books and an almost complete run of the Rutland Newsliner. The Rutland Railroad survived many accidents and natural disasters, but it could not survive the 1960 strike of union members due to changes in working conditions, and the subsequent legal proceedings which ultimately reached the Supreme Court of the United States. The Rutland Railroad Archive has grown remarkably since its inception in 2001 and already contains a wide range and depth of material to document the history of the railroad since its beginning. Resources in the archive are being conserved, organized, and stored in a facility that provides for excellent climate control, security, and stewardship. This notable archive is largely the result of the following members of the Rutland Railroad Historical Society who have generously and thoughtfully donated many of the archival materials that form the core of the Rutland Railroad archives. Their foresight and generosity have assured that these important artifacts will be preserved, organized, and made accessible for future generations of scholars and railroad buffs. Other members of the Rutland Railroad Historical Society have contributed to the Heaton L. Bullock Memorial Fund to provide important support for the preservation and conservation of items that need to be deacidified, professionally cleaned, or encapsulated. Persons who would like to make a donation to the Heaton Bullock Memorial Fund may send their check made out to Middlebury College to the Vermont collection at the main library of Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont, zip code 05753.